What is up, YouTube? So I've decided that for this movements and mechanics myth busting series I'm doing, I'm just going to break it down into 3 relatively simple videos. I was kind of planning on spreading this out over 7, 8, 9 videos, kind of however many myths I could think of, but I decided I'm going to simplify it. We're just going to do 3 big large format videos. So congrats, this is my first large format video. Hopefully you can stick around with me. But today I'm just going to be covering all the myths, or the main ones that I think are the most egregious, if you will, within the squat. And the next video will obviously be covering the bench, and then finally the last video will be covering the deadlift. So before we dive into this fully, I do want to kind of iterate one big thing, well, a few things, but mainly I want to iterate one thing and actually do a kind of a very quick review over what we discussed last time. That was the video leading into this one. But the thing that I would like to iterate is that obviously coaching is it's nothing close to a one-size-fits-all approach. Every coach should strive to really coach, obviously correct, critique, and really make changes off each athlete's individual differences. With that being said, these myths that I'm busting today, we're going to be comparing to these irrefutable mechanical lessons that I covered in the last video. Not only will these lessons kind of show how silly these cues actually are, but show that they can truly be detrimental in some cases, harming the athlete's lifts a lot more than helping them. And even if it is one of these instances where the cue isn't necessarily harming, I think something that a lot of athletes could benefit from is just simplifying their quote-unquote task list heading into a lift. I think as you, or probably any of us, we head into a movement, whether it's squat, bench, or deadlift, kind of having a few things on top of our head of, I want to do this, this, and this. And I think the more that we can simplify that, especially with things that are not helpful at all, and in some cases detrimental, the more simple it is, the better it can be. So for a quick recap, here are the 3 biomechanical lessons that we discussed in the previous video. Number 1, attachment sites. A muscle is only capable of performing actions that occur whenever there is a shortening or contraction between the attachment sites. This mostly includes either bringing those attachment sites together or using the other one as an anchor, bringing the other attachment site to it. This does also include either creating or adding stability to the joint that a muscle is attached to as well. Number 2, agonist and antagonist. While a muscle is working and shortening and contracting, the antagonist of it, the opposite side of it, has to relax and lengthen. We cannot have an agonist and an antagonist be contracting and shortening at the same time, otherwise there would be absolutely zero joint movement. And lastly, number 3, the sliding filament theory. Look at this as being like the muscles work as similarly to a ratchet strap. We have 2 protein filaments. One has to latch on another one and pull it in order to shorten the muscle and get it to contract. This is super important to notate and to know, because our muscle is going to always be at its strongest at its mid-range. If it has plenty of, say, ratchet strap that it's already gotten some leverage on and has some friction to pull on, but there's still plenty left to pull. There's still plenty of room to go. But say if we are fully shortened, there's nothing else that we can pull. If we are fully lengthened, we don't have a whole lot of leverage or anything that we can pull on now. So knowing that a muscle is going to be at its strongest mid-range and going to be at its weakest or least effective when it's fully lengthened or fully shortened. All right, with that being out of the way, we're going to finally jump into our first myth, and it is going to be a doozy, and that is the concept encompassing around the entire idea of knee valgus in the squat and why it happens and what's causing it, and kind of idea that we need to be driving the knees out, creating some sort of foot pressure, or that we are quote-unquote losing or not using the glutes in the squat. So let's take a look at why there might even be any sort of knee cave or knee valgus within the squat. By far the most common that we're going to see is just anytime an athlete has longer levers. So if we're seeing somebody has longer femurs or a longer torso, it's going to create a lot more demands on them just to hit the rules of sport by hitting depth. And actually a perfect example here is my wife. She has femurs as long as I am tall. One of the many reasons why I married her. But as that being something I like, it does not make her a very good prodigious person for being the world's best squatter. We're wanting shorter femurs there for a very similar reason to this. So with her having those longer femurs, it means that for her to actually just capitalize the squat and actually have an appropriate squat and hit depth the way that she should, she's going to have a lot more chesting. She's going to have a lot more of that sharp torso angle to actually be able to continue to have something balanced appropriately. But with that, and with anybody with a similar structure to her, that means there's going to be a lot more hip flexion occurring in squat. She's going to have the glute max and the hamstrings. Our primary hip extensors are going to be a very lengthened and very weakened range of motion. And knowing how sliding filament theory works, we know that this is putting her in a very compromised position to where her glute max and her hamstrings aren't able to get a lot of leverage to help perform their proper hip extension. But luckily, there is one very underappreciated hip extensor underlying all this, and that is our adductor magnus. So this adductor magnus attaches to not only the pelvis, but to the femur, meaning that if we cause some sort of contraction there and actually shorten it together, it's going to reorientate that pelvis to being upright, creating really good hip extension. But as we know, a muscle, just because it's contracting, does not mean it can only do one job. It's going to perform whatever else is entailed and included with that contraction, meaning that that adductor is also in charge of adduction and adducting the femurs together and causing some sort of internal rotation. And that is wherein lies where there ends up being some sort of knee cave or knee valgus within the squat. So in order for our body to actually capitalize on the benefits of having some hip extension from the adductor magnus, there's going to also just be some degree of internal rotation with the femurs and some sort of adduction. And that is perfectly okay. That is way too demonized and should not be looked at as being some sort of a problem. It should actually be looked at as a good thing. Hey, your adductors are doing what we are wanting them to do and helping us get out of the bottom of a squat. And sure, there are several athletes that are built very well and probably have short femurs, looking at me, to where I will probably never have any really degree of valgus that's noticeable in the squat just because I'm never getting this severely heavy chest lean to where my glute max and hamstrings, they're right there ready to work whenever I come out of the bottom of the squat. And there are several other people like that as well. This also brings us around to the idea or the thought of us losing our glutes within the squat, which I recently heard at a meet. But it's just, once again, it was one of the things that gave me some of the biggest heebie-jeebies ever. But the glutes that are actually being primarily used in a squat is going to be our glute max. The glute max is once again going to be a very powerful hip extensor and sure can help with a little bit of external rotation at the hip at the very, very end range of motion. So it can't even really help with that during the duration of the squat. It just might only do it if we get that glute max to be as short as possible. So in context of squatting and knee valgus, the only glute that can be quote unquote lost or not being strong enough would be our glute medius, which is in charge of abduction of the hip and bringing that leg out and away from the inside. But once again, here's where it's funny, is that glute has to be lost, once again, according to our agonist and antagonist, in order for that actual adduction to do its thing and for those adductors to do its thing. If that glute med stays active, we won't get the benefit of our adductors actually performing hip extension. So in the vast, large majority of cases, let the adductors do their thing. Don't be worried about losing your glutes or anything silly like that. Let the adductors actually assist in hip extension because the glute that's being touted as being lost doesn't do anything for hip extension. The glute max certainly will, but the glute medius will not. So forget about the glute medius, ditch your little hip circle, and I promise you, you'll squat much more. Just focus on good center mass control and good foot pressure. So a few more simple reasons for why we might be experiencing knee cave in the squat is simply there's poor center mass control going on, meaning our body's trying to bring more weight to the inside to actually create a proper downward force to exert force in the opposite direction upward. So you'll see this a lot if somebody's stance is very, very wide, or if they're just simply putting too much pressure on the outside of their foot on the descent, creating some sort of shift to actually realign everything in the right direction. And that's why 99 times out of 100, having pressure on the outside of the foot will be a very poor cue for actually having the most powerful and successful squat possible. But all this also goes to say that if you are experiencing some degree of knee valgus in your squat, you probably don't need to stress it. As long as you're still progressing very well within your squat and you're not getting any sort of pain, most likely that either your adductors are working really hard for you or you just have a very wide stance that helps you hit depth easier or just feels more comfortable. And that's a-okay. All right, on to myth number 2, and that is like either lat packing, trying to force the lats, or some severe external rotation within the squat, trying to create some sort of spinal rigidity or stiffness or preventing any sort of change in torso angle within the squat. So there is a handful of athletes and coaches that think that trying to do these two things is going to help either create more stiffness within the spine, either preventing a change in torso angle or preventing any sort of spinal flexion that might be occurring within the squat. And this all comes back around to that dreadful thought to me that the lats are somehow in charge of actually helping with any sort of spinal rigidity. Yes, absolutely, the lats, they attach to the humerus and also attach down on the spine, which, as I said earlier, if something attaches to a joint or to at an attachment site, it might very well help with stability and almost always will create stability. But in this instance is going to help, yes, create stability for each individual vertebrae it attaches to, but that in no way, shape, or form has anything to do with actual flexion or extension of the spine. When at the end of the day, that comes down to this insanely complex structure of spinal extensors that we already have. But let's pretend that somehow these lats do even pertain to helping out with some sort of spinal extension and preventing flexion. Then going back to our going back to our sliding filament theory, we'll know that just because we're trying to make this lat insanely forced and insanely contracted, it's going to do a better job of this. That is just not the case. We are way better off just leaving it alone at its mid-range, and if it is going to help with something like that, it will do it more effectively from that mid-range. And the same should be obvious for the external rotation. People try to think that they have to get their elbows further and further under them in the squat just isn't true. But once again, I think this is even more so than the lats because of how insanely far away the supraspinatus, infraspinatus, subscaps, how all these small muscles that are attached to the shoulder and the scapula, very far away from the actual spine and especially the lumbar spine, aren't going to have any sort of impact on what the spine is doing when it comes to flexion or extension. But once again, let's pretend that they do. Us putting them in a unreasonably shortened position just to piss off shoulders, piss off bicep tendons, cause some sort of agitation that is not needed just to have zero benefit on what the spine is doing. So, but after all this is said, what can we actually do to help assist in either creating a more consistent and stable torso angle or preventing some sort of, egregious amount of spinal flexion within the squat? And honestly, the easiest way to say this is just by summarizing what constitutes what I would say is good form within the squat. And actually, I'm going to go as far as to say that this doesn't even just include the squat. It goes as far as, good form in all three lifts. And that is, first, does it follow the rules of the sport? Are we getting proper depth? Are we getting proper pauses? Are we getting proper tensioning? Are we getting a proper erect lockout on a deadlift? So on and so forth. Does our form appease those rules? There's check mark number one. Number two is, how is our center of mass control? How actually are we stacking ourselves and, organizing ourselves under this barbell to make sure that we are not only balancing as best as possible, but whenever we are applying force, it is actually properly fighting its gravity and not throwing us in some crazy direction. And sure, these are insanely blanketed statements, but I think very rightly so. These are things that everybody has to do to be a powerlifter. We have to have rules that we have to follow for the meet, but we also have to have good center mass control no matter who we are or what that looks like, because that will look very different for everybody because it's so insanely individually based. But at the end of the day, we still have to do that in order to lift maximal loads. So once again, referring back to the first myth we talked about, if somebody has longer levers or a longer torso or longer femurs, that means they're just going to have a much sharper torso angle within their squat just to maintain that proper center mass control and that proper foot pressure. Otherwise, if they try to stay as upright as say I can, they're going to get dumped backwards. They're going to fall, and it's not going to feel good, and they're not going to be able to squat a lot either. And therein lies a lot of the issues that we have, as a sport, is that, social media is a huge thing, and it's obviously a thing that a lot of us coaches depend on, but also we get to see all these insanely gifted and genetically perfect athletes for the sport. So it's really easy to try and see and replicate what we have to do, even though it might not necessarily be accurate. So I think one of those big things is people trying to think they have to be super upright within either a deadlift or a squat or any of these things whenever it has nothing to do with how they are personally anatomically set up or built. So they have this idea that they have to be too upright within a squat or they have to be too upright within a deadlift, meaning that the center mass is going to be way off and there has to be some sort of adjustment. So that's where you'll see a large shift in torso angle. That's going to be why we see that most times. Just that is our body just returning to where its center mass control is the most ideal to actually exert force in the proper direction. So very simply, as just a proper, correction of that is to embrace it. Don't be afraid to actually have a proper amount of chest lean heading into the descent of the squat. Once again, there is actually some people that they need to be slightly more upright on their descent than they are the ascent, just for balancing reasons. But the more that we can minimize that insane shift of the torso angle, the more we can minimize the effects of inertia of the barbell, and even maybe the effects of spinal flexion happening from us getting dumped forward under load and putting great demand on the spinal extensors. And that's why it gets to be the irony of this cue is why you'll see that so many people that are trying to force all this, big ribs up, or lat packing or external rotation causing this big rib up, pulling all this center mass backwards, you'll see that even sure beforehand they were dealing with some sort of torso dump or torso angle dump in the squat, is they're now making it more egregious than ever because they're just continually bringing more and more weight, more and more mass back behind where their center mass should be, making it to where they're getting thrown forward more and more and more. But once again, if we have 300, 400, 500 pounds on our back, that's going to have a lot of inertia to where it's going to be a lot worse than it was. Say if we have a shift of 15 degrees instead of 5 degrees, it's going to be a lot easier to manage a 5-degree shift in the inertia that comes to that than a big 15, 20-degree shift. So if you are one of these athletes that's having some sort of an issue with your torso's getting dumped forward in the squat, you're going from being a certain level of upright to, as soon as you come out of the hole, you're way more leaned over. Don't think that your back's too weak. Don't think that you need to tighten your lats more, that you're doing something wrong. I'd say a stripper squat's another way to call it. Don't think that that's wrong. Think that, hey, I need to almost embrace this and go into some sort of greater degree of torso lean to manage your balance and your center mass better, because that's just how you're built. And with that, look at foot pressure. Make sure that you're not being too biased forward or backward. Make sure you have very, very equal foot pressure. Once again, that's even a very individually based thing that, if you work with a coach, they can help you work through that very, very well. Okay, and speaking of footing and rooting, here it comes on to my final myth for the day, and that is the concept of rooting the feet within the squat. And admittedly, this is a term I've used before, but I think it's a term that's also kind of improperly branched out away from its original meaning to just kind of meaning, for me, I've used it in the frame of reference of just overall contact with the foot of the floor, just making sure that the whole thing is staying actually planted, or also just in reference to where foot pressure is being applied. But I think at its true essence, rooting is this teaching of that you need to be literally trying to obviously find the tripod of your foot, which once again, nothing inherently wrong with that, but then grabbing the floor with it and actually causing some sort of flexion within the musculature of the feet in order to grab the floor. And while I believe that this myth out of the three is probably the least egregious on the negative impacts it could have, I think it's going to be also the most ironically counterintuitive based off the squat at its most core mechanics. So if we are trying to shorten the foot and flex the foot in order to actually go into any sort of degree of dorsiflexion, meaning that there has to be any sort of level of plantar extension, I know it's not a real term, but there's going to be extension of the opposite side in order for dorsiflexion to occur. The foot has to flatten out during dorsiflexion in order for there to be any sort of forward knee travel in the squat, and sort of in order to unlock any sort of ankle mobility, that foot has to flatten out. So once again, we are overcomplicating the whole situation by just forcing a cue that's going to be literally disappearing as soon as we start our descent. As soon as that knee has to travel forward any sort of degree, even if you're a very vertical shin athlete, there's going to be a very slight degree of that knee traveling forward, meaning that that foot has to flatten out. In order for there to be any degree of there actually being any sort of dorsiflexion, we're going to have a nice flat foot, or a foot going to be relatively more flat than it was to do so. So that means we're obviously doing something that's going to be undone immediately, having zero benefit. But if we're trying to shorten our foot and decrease the size of our tripod, once again, nothing wrong with the tripod, but usually the more spread out and the bigger base that we can have, the better. And even if we end up accidentally putting more pressure on the outside of the foot, causing a lot more problems like we discussed within the first myth. So once again, to bring it around to a very simple cue that I discussed, I think in both myths before this, so all three myths is don't worry about trying to grab the floor. Just make sure that you have relatively very equal foot pressure, and that will be a weight better of a start than anything else. Just make sure that the entire foot feels nice and heavy. All right, and that's it for my first long-form YouTube video. I'm not even sure how long this sucker is going to be, but I know it's going to be a lot longer than my usual 10 to 15 minutes here. So thank you for sticking out with me and really making sure I'm getting this whole point across, because this is stuff that I'm obviously insanely passionate about, and I just want to make this whole thing easier and simpler for everybody. Obviously, there's always going to be cues. There's always going to be, it's going to be tough for coaches to not accidentally over-cue somebody. But the more just kind of BS stuff we can get gone to where, hey, we are left with a handful of a lot more effective things, then we'll be in a much better place. So if you liked the video and if you liked the content, please like, subscribe, all that fun stuff. I am also going to open my books back up after all this wedding stuff is all now gone and said and done. I'm really not sure how much I'm going to open it up to. I've been pretty full for a while. but I still want to kind of explore seeing what my business is capable of. So coaching inquiries, I'll put a link down below if you have interest in that as well. Thank you everybody so much.